Okay, so welcome again to the Seed Library of LA, Altadena. It is July 18th, 2020, and I will start a short presentation on seed saving for squash seeds. And before I get to my slides, I just have a few slides. I wanted to start just by talking about the seed that we choose to put in the ground when we're seed saving, when we're growing to save our seeds. There are typically there's just two kinds of seeds that we can buy for our purposes. There are hybrid seeds and there are open pollinated seeds. And for the purposes of seed saving, we have to grow plants that are open pollinated. Hybrid seeds are great for reasons like, disease resistance or for certain varieties. However, saving seeds from hybrids is not recommended because the seeds that they produce aren't necessarily true, what we call true seeds. We don't know. It's not, they're unstable is what the term is. You could plant that seed that you collect and not get the plant that was what you grew. It could be the DNA inside that seed may have reverted back to one of the parent plants. Whereas an open pollinated seed is the parent, and it comes from a plant that has not been cross or hybrid, so it'll produce a seed that is, when pollinated correctly, will grow a plant true to the parent plant. So always when growing for seed collecting vegetables, it's important to start with an open pollinated seed. In our seed catalogs or in the store where you're purchasing seeds, seed packets or seeds that are hybrid seeds have to be labeled as such. It's one of the agricultural laws, so they're clearly marked as hybrid seeds. Sometimes they're marked with an F1. Often they'll tell you why, like what this is resistant to, whatever it is. So if they're not marked hybrid, you can assume that they're open pollinated. Some packages will say open pollinated, but not all of them. It's not common to see open pollinated unless maybe you read down into the fine print. The other label you'll see is heirloom, and all heirlooms are open pollinated seeds. They're labeled as heirlooms because they're a type of variety that has a documented lineage. So they know that either the seed originally came from a particular tribe or family or even a region of this country or anywhere in the world. But there's some sort of documentation, and sometimes they say they are seeds with stories. So all heirloom seeds are open pollinated seeds. So if it's labeled heirloom, you're good to go. So, there are seed companies, of course, that only sell heirlooms, and then there are seed companies that only sell open pollinated seeds, and there are seed companies that will sell all varieties. So just check your packages. I was looking through mine, and I don't think I have any hybrid seeds in my seed collection right now because I mostly order seeds from heirloom seed companies. Okay, so now I'm going to start with a few slides, and then I will pause for questions and then return you to the slides, and then we can have a Q&A at the end. Okay. Oops. Sorry, just getting my screen ready. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start with just a real brief review of flower anatomy and pollination because it's important when we're talking about seed saving. And in front of you, you have just a simple diagram of a flower. This flower contains both female and male parts, and just a quick review of plant biology. So the stigma is the female part of the flower. Let me get my pointer. So this is the part of the flower where the pollen that comes from the male part of the flower, okay, so the stamen, these two parts together, the filament and the anther. So the pollen will be resting here and will in some way, by wind or insect or other way, will land onto the stigma and start the pollination process. The little pollen grains that land here will actually send tubes down to the ovary of the flower where the ovules are. That's what will become the seeds. And in cases of fruit, this is the part of the flower that swells and becomes a zucchini or an apple, or whatever, or what have you. In the case of squash flowers, the flowers are separate. The parts are separated into two different kinds of flowers. So a squash plant has male and female flowers. So on the right-hand side, the photograph shows a male squash flower. My thumb, or sorry, excuse me, my finger is pointing to the stem. You can see that there's no ovule attached to this flower. So if you look to the left, the nice thing about squash flowers is it's really easy to tell which ones are the females because the flowers are attached to the end of what looks like the young zucchini or pumpkin or whatever squash you're growing. And that's the ovule. That's the part that will swell and grow into our fruit. So the case for squash, again, so we have a male flower and then a female flower. And often with squash plants, the male flowers will appear first. You may get, several before any female flowers appear. But don't fear, they should come. And then when you have both male and female flowers blooming at the same time, you can then of course get your fruit and you get pollination. So pollen, so this all the pollen from the different families or species of squash can cross-pollinate, and this is where it becomes tricky for seed saving. So if one type of zucchini gets pollinated from, so let's say a green zucchini gets pollinated from the male flower of a yellow zucchini, you're still going to get a green zucchini from that plant. But if you collect the seeds from those zucchinis and plant them again, you may get some combination of the green zucchini and the variety of yellow zucchini. I'm going to stop it right here just to answer any questions about pollination, if there's any just general questions about anything about pollination. You can either unmute yourself or just ask in the chat. Okay.
I have a question, Jessica.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the difference between what you described earlier as a hybrid and then what you just described now as like combined pollination with like a yellow and a green zucchini?
Yeah, I will. I'm going to get more into that right now as yeah, as we dive in. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again and talk about about all that cross-pollination stuff. There. Okay, so varieties in the same species can cross-pollinate. So that means that, like I described before, that if you have two varieties of zucchini, one can pollinate the other and you still have a nice, delicious zucchini to eat, which is great. But if you want to save seeds, then we have to be sure that cross-pollination doesn't happen. On the screen now, you'll see I have a list here, and on the left in the bold are the 4 common species of squash that we grow in our home gardens. They're all in the family Cucurbita, which is Latin for gourd. And then on the right, I have, this is just my garden, what it looked like a few months ago. I have listed the varieties within the species that I have. So for example, in Cucurbita maxima, I was growing red curry, Cinderella carriage pumpkins, and Lakota squash. These three these three varieties can cross-pollinate each other. So the carriage pumpkins can pollinate my red curry can pollinate my Lakota. So when they produce seeds, they will produce a hybrid seed pretty much. But we have no control over which traits are going to appear in those future seeds. So, but also, so my red curry squash cannot cross-pollinate with the Black Beauty zucchini. So it's good to know which species your varieties fall into so that you can better can know where the cross-pollination is going to happen. So if I want to harvest red curry seeds so that I can share with the library or with my neighbors or just to grow again next year, I have to make sure that those red curry female flowers do not get pollinated by the carriage pumpkins or the Lakota squash pollen. So this gets tricky. Let me stop. Let me just see if there's any questions at that point. I just want to make sure that part is clear before I move on. Okay. So this becomes tricky because squash is insect pollinated, and we can't control where the bees are going to land first and second and and third, and where they've been before they've come to our gardens. So in the case of squash and any seed or any plant that's insect pollinated, we have to create barriers. And let me go to the next slide. So we have to isolate squash blossoms in order to make sure that we're controlling where and what's pollinating them so that we can get a true seed. So seed savers use physical barriers. You can also use distance and timing. That's more difficult with insect pollinated plants. So for insect pollinated plants, the recommended distance between varieties in the same species is a half a mile. So you can see how in a urban or suburban setting, that's really not possible. Usually we're growing many different varieties in our own gardens. And so are our neighbors probably, or the person who lives, 5 blocks away. And we don't know, what they're, so it's hard to control in a setting like Altadena or anywhere in a metropolitan area for distance. Same with timing. So sometimes we can save seeds by timing the blooming, but because squash is a vine, it's constantly growing and putting out new flowers. And so it's difficult and often producing throughout the growing season. So it's difficult to use timing as a method for isolation. So what we use are physical barriers, and you can see that in the photo, this is clothespins to keep the flowers like physically closed until pollination can happen. You can also use netting. However, then you have to introduce pollinators into the netting somehow, and that seems trickier to me, and this seems pretty straightforward. So how this works is that the evening before you think those flowers are going to open, you need to go into your garden with some clothespins and clip the flowers shut. And this is true, these are female flowers, but you need to clip the male flowers shut too. The squash flowers open like at dawn, super early, and they will, the pollinators will come right away and start doing their jobs. So we close those male flowers too, just to be extra sure, because if a bee lands that's already been to several other plants, there's a possibility that some of the pollen that the bee is already carrying will kind of shake off and then contaminate your pollen in the male flower. So you close up both. Then when you want to pollinate, you you get your male flower first, and you can clip it off with just some clippers and bring it to the female flowers. And we have a little video. There's a couple different ways you can do it. We have a little video at the end that will show you. And then transfer the pollen into the female, open the female flowers, but be sure to keep the flowers intact. So open the female flowers and brush the pollen onto the stigma, and then close them up again and pin them back shut. And this way we ensure that the only pollen that gets onto that flower is the pollen that we put there. After you've pollinated or hand pollinated your squash, so you want to make sure that you're taking, of course, the male flowers from the same variety. It doesn't have to be the same plant, just has to be the same variety. So if you have 3 curry squashes plants growing in your garden, you can take a male flower from a different plant of the same variety and use that to pollinate, but just make sure it's of the same variety. So then you close it back up to make sure that that's the only pollen that's there. And then you have to mark the fruit. So you remember, this is the one that I grew or I pollinated for seeds. And you can do that a couple ways. One is to scar the fruit with a fingernail. You can mark a little X or whatever mark you want to make. It won't harm the fruit. It'll heal it pretty quick, and that mark will be there until you harvest. The other way is to tie something loosely at the base of the fruit. I've seen people use like a plastic ribbon kind of that you can tie around the base, and then you can actually write on the ribbon like the variety, maybe the date that you did the pollination. You know, you can record some additional information if you use the ribbon to mark it. And then you let it be, and you let it grow, and you let it do its thing. And then comes the harvesting and storing of the seed. You want to let, of course, the plant grow to maturity, because you have to make sure that those seeds mature. And that's different. Like, so for summer squashes, like our zucchinis, the squashes that we eat soft, those are the squashes that we are harvesting while they're still immature. So those seeds are immature when we're harvesting zucchini. So those squashes, like the winter squashes, need to be left on the vine until they, are way bigger, like especially the zucchinis, than we would normally eat. They're going to get tough, yeah, sometimes they'll even just color a little bit. They'll get an orange or a yellow tinge to them. So you want to leave the summer squashes on way longer than you normally would. And for that reason, you also have to take into consideration that if you choose your first summer squash to be your seed saving squash, the production of that particular plant is going to fall down, like it's going to get lower, because the plant's going to think, oh, I'm producing my seeds, I've done my job, I don't need to produce much more fruit. So if you let your zucchini that you enjoy eating produce a little bit and you eat and you enjoy it, you can choose a later squash. You can choose a later squash to be the one that will be, or 2, if you, however much you're doing, to save the seeds. I wouldn't wait too long. You don't want to do it when the plant's slowing down and not as healthy and maybe more susceptible to disease and stuff. So just keep that in mind when you're saving summer squash for seeds, that once you're letting a few grow really big, the summer squash production is going to fall. Winter squash we leave on the vine anyway, and so for that there wouldn't be much difference in letting those grow, because we harvest those squashes when the seeds are typically pretty mature. If you want to be sure, after you've removed your winter squash from the vines, you can let them sit for a couple, 2-3 weeks. If you harvest a lot of them, this is what you do to cure them anyway for storage. But those seeds inside there will mature even a little more while they're sitting in a cool, shady spot. Of course, now we're going to eat this one. We're going to eat this squash, because this is the winter squashes we eat when they're ripe like this. And so just remember that if you've used the ribbon method to mark, you keep that ribbon tied to your stem, and then when you cut this one open that this is, even if you're going to eat it, It's the one that that you'll be pulling the seeds out and preparing for saving. So these seeds are what we call wet seeds, because they're seeds that are inside. They're not drying, from an exposed flower or pod or anything like that. So they take a little bit of cleaning. So you just remove the seeds, both from like summer squashes or winter squashes, and remove the fruit and the pulp. An easier way to do this is to put everything in a bowl of water, and because the pulp, as it loosens up from the seeds, will float. So you can kind of scoop it off, and then keep adding new water. Sometimes you'll see that they'll say, oh, if the seeds are floating, that means they're not viable, so discard those seeds. And that's not always true. So just be cautious. My kind of go-to is, if I have a pumpkin that I'm harvesting seeds from, and most of the seeds are sinking, and a few have floated to the top, I'll discard those seeds. But there are some squashes where the seeds are small enough that they're going to all float. And that does not mean that you have a whole batch of bad, not viable seeds. So there's sort of this myth that if they float, they're not viable. Once you've gotten them all cleaned and separated from the pulp and the fruit, you want to pat them dry, and then not with a paper towel, because that'll just stick and leave paper scraps behind. On a single layer, if you have trays or a screen, is even better, and let them just air out in a cool, shady, airy place where there's a lot of air circulation to really dry before you store them. Even a little bit of moisture, can create mold. And then of course, now you don't have a seed when you go to plant them the following year. And then make sure you label them. It's really important to label variety and the year that they were harvested, so you can keep track of how old your seed is. And I was going to say something, I just forgot what it was. Well, it'll come back to me, I'm sure. So, in the library, we always put everything in paper envelopes, just, for added, some people, if you're sure your seeds are super dry, you can put them in jars, or other sorts of containers that are airtight, and then you're ready to go. And then, and share them with us or your friends, or keep some for yourself for planting the following year. Before I show we talk about hand pollinating a little bit more, I'm going to stop the screen again and look to see if there's any questions. Okay, so will the fruit look different when it's cross-pollinated? Not for squash. Not in that. So like if it's in my garden right now, I have a carriage pumpkin, and it gets cross-pollinated with the curry squash, that fruit for this season is not going to look different. Next season, if I harvested those seeds, the fruit could look different. This is not true for all crops. The one that's most common, that corn, when corn cross-pollinates, because corn is the seed, right? We're eating the seed. That's the part that we ingest. So I know with corn, I don't grow a lot of corn, but that sweet corn, if you cannot grow sweet corn and popcorn or maize corn in the same spot, because it's wind pollinated. But if a sweet corn gets pollinated from like a popcorn, your corn isn't going to turn out very tasty. It gets very starchy and loses the quality of the sweet corn that we like. But that's because we're eating the seed. But for squashes and most other fruit, the cross-pollination doesn't show up until the next generation. If that makes sense. Okay.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
This is Gina. I wanted to just double check. You said for your winter squashes, if you have closed the flower, like for your red curry or your pumpkin, you've closed the flower so you're sure that the genetics are going to stay true to that variety, you can both eat that pumpkin and save the seeds, because that fruit is is mature.
Yes.
Cool.
Yes.
Okay. So then my second question, I have 3. My second question is, could you speak to store-bought organic winter squashes and the viability of those seeds? And do you, I guess, what's the gamble here of like, you have your winter squash. I get a lot of volunteers from my store-bought squash, and would it be advisable to save seeds from that? Do you know what you're getting?
Probably not. I have a lot of volunteers melons in my garden this year, and I'm just letting them go to see what, I guess you don't know what you're getting because you don't know the conditions in the field where they were grown, right? Was it this giant field of all the same variety of melon or squash, and then maybe the risk of a cross pollination is much lower? Was it grown in a way where like the next variety was a mile away? But we don't have any of that information. You could try it, but for the purposes, like for your own, curiosity, but for the purposes of the seed library, we would not be able to take those seeds because we don't know where, we don't know the conditions of the field where that original fruit came from. So if I bought a melon from the farmer's market and then took some of those seeds and planted them, I could not then turn the next generation of seed from that plant to the library, just because we don't know the origin.
Sure. Awesome. Okay. And then I guess that kind of runs into my third question, which is there seeds that come out of the compost pile? There is no way that they can cross-pollinate in the compost, correct? It must happen via, like, haven't you experienced that where you're like, I only planted this one squash and then it comes out of the compost pile and it's nothing you've ever planted before?
Yes. So what probably happened is that those seeds came, so let's say I grew a black beauty zucchini, right? And I one year and I didn't do any seed saving from that plant, and then maybe I had a few zucchinis that got away from me, and the ones that sort of hide until they're 3 feet long and not really good and to eat anymore. And I threw that zucchini into my compost pile. Those are the seeds. Those seeds, we have no idea, how they were pollinated. Were they pollinated from the same black beauty zucchini, or were they pollinated from the Max's Gold that I had sitting next to it? So that's why you get those like crazy weird squashes growing out of your compost pile, because they were cross-pollinated.
And even potentially by a neighbor if
Yes.
you've only had the one variety.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, and then just to close, we have just a little video. This is from Danielle, one of our volunteers. This is from her Instagram. It's one method of, she demonstrates one method of hand pollination, and then I'll talk about a second. They're very similar. So let me share my screen again. Let's see if this works, because I have the link. Okay, great. Okay, so this is Danielle is pollinating zucchini, and I don't think there's any sound, but so she's using a paintbrush to collect the pollen from the male flower. See, as you can see, it's all over, and taking it to the female flower. This is of the same variety. And she's going to brush the pollen all over the stigma of the female flower. Okay. You can also do this, so paintbrush is a great way. You can also do it by snipping the male flower off the plant and taking off all the petals and just directly applying the pollen from the stamen to the stigma that way too. Either way works. And And then just if you're, of course, doing it for seed saving, you can close that flower back up. You can also hand pollinate if you're just finding that your pollination rates aren't very high. I happen to be growing a zucchini in my garden that there's only one. I only have one zucchini right now, and so there's no other flowers. So I'm hand pollinating just to make sure that I get some fruit, just because I feel like there's not very many flowers. So you can hand pollinate just to ensure that you get a good harvest. You don't have to do it just to seed save. So that yeah, so that's pretty much it. Seeds from squash, typically for storage, last, they say 6 years. However, I have germinated some seeds from the library that have been older, but your germination rates will just fall as they get older. So if you're planting seeds that are 8 years old or something, just plant more of them just to ensure that you'll get some germination. That's the other thing you can do too that I didn't mention, is that after you harvest your seeds for seed saving, you can do a germination test, and you can, take, a number of your seeds and just see if they'll germinate, just either in a wet cloth or, in a shallow soil, not to grow them, but just, and then you can know that you have a good stock of seeds. So you can do that.
Jessica, two
Yeah.
questions. One is, how much pollen do you need to transfer?
As much as you can grab, I would say. I've noticed that, like, if I've tried to do some hand pollinated and I've waited, not for seed saving, but just for pollination purposes, and I've waited till late morning, sometimes there's like barely any pollen left on the stake, because those bees get busy like super early, and it hasn't worked because there's not enough. So just grab as much of it as you can, and give it a good, like the amount that Danielle had on that paintbrush was a good gauge, I think.
Cool. Second question, once you've saved the seeds, how long do you need to wait before you can do a germination test?
Just wait until they're dry, and then you can just do it, right away.
So you could turn around and replant the same seed a few weeks later?
Yeah, sure.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Jessica, this is Ayla. To bounce off that question, does that also go for things like stone fruit? Obviously, stone fruit has a kind of longer season. We're in it right now. Could I essentially eat my plum, stick it in the ground once it's dry, and would it grow, or not necessarily?
So stone fruit and just fruit trees in general typically have a totally different growing method. You could stick it in the ground and you would probably, and if you could get a tree, the chances of that tree producing the plum that you just enjoyed are very small.
Got it.
Because there's cross-pollination happening among the stone fruit as well. The other thing too is that typically most of our stone fruit, apples, avocados are all grafted trees. And that's the way that they ensure a fruit that's true to the parent plant. They also, grafted trees will give you fruit much, much sooner than a tree planted from seed, because they're grafting a mature, what they call a scion wood, that they've taken from a mother tree, and so that it's just in a different stage of its life, and will give you, even when they're quite small, they'll still give you a little bit of fruit.
Thank you. So then that goes to what you were talking about earlier when we talk about cross-pollination, and obviously things like the squash blossoms where you want to manually do it, but wouldn't that essentially account for all our seeds, because I can't control the bees, the hornets, the wasps, everything that's coming into my garden might have something. So wouldn't technically everything be cross-pollinated and contaminated, for lack of from an origin aspect or the heirloom aspect?
Yes, all of the insect pollinated plants, that is something to, yes. And it's more difficult, like for melons and cucumbers, the blossoms are a lot smaller.
Mm-hmm.
And it's harder. I've actually never tried saving seeds from those smaller, like melon or cucumber blossoms and don't know the like protocols about isolating flowers. However, that also, we do have crops in our summer gardens that are self-pollinated. So tomatoes, eggplant are the big ones. If you have warm season lettuce in your garden, that's also self-pollinated. So those, especially, so with those, with the not cucumbers, eggplant and tomatoes, they have a flower that have both the male and female parts in the same flower, and they're also closed up pretty tightly. So it's hard for a pollinator to get in there. And all you have to do, so there's a little bit of a caveat to that, because there are, so bumblebees can pollinate tomatoes. The way that bumblebees get the pollen out of, it's fascinating, the way that bumblebees get pollen out of the flower is they land on it, and the vibration that they make shakes the pollen out. So they're actually not even getting like all the way inside. They're just the act of that buzzing that they make shakes the pollen onto them. But it's sort of a low occurrence, I guess. And some people say that the potato leaf tomato plants, so the tomato plants that have sort of those, the wider, pointier leaves, are more prone to bumblebee pollination. An easy way to get around that is before your tomato flowers have opened. I wonder if I have one of the bags here. I used to. You can use those little really lightweight gift bags. I think I might have one. Yes. These to cinch over your blossoms. So if you wanted to be extra sure that you were harvesting a seed that was true, that's a tomato, you can use these on bean blossoms too. You just wrap it right around up to the stem and you cinch it shut. And that is enough to keep, any pollinator out. Just when the flowers have opened, you can just tap, shake your tomatoes a little bit to shake the pollen around. And then once the fruit has set, you can remove this and then mark your tomato. I use a little plastic bread bag holder, the little plastic things you use to close your bread bag.
Yes. Yeah.
You can hang those right onto the stem, right by the tomato or the bean set that you have used, you have isolated. But because they're self-pollinated, we don't have to do the pollinating. We just have to keep the insects away.
Fair enough. And my last question, it's sort of squash related in the sense of when we're eating or harvesting squash blossoms for their edibleness, is there a preference between male, female?
I think it's typically the males that are
the male,
because there's way more of them too. Like you don't want to like sacrifice your zucchini. Yeah. So and typically the plants will have a lot more male flowers than female flowers, so you can take the extras.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
I have a couple things. First, I want to also vote for those little organza bags. They're the best. If people don't know, you can actually put those over your berries and it'll protect your berries if you're not able to get your strawberries before the bugs and the birds and the blueberries. So you can use those organza bags for protecting your fruit and your berries. But the other thing was we have a question from Janice. So I want to just ask to make sure that we can get to that. So how long can seeds last if properly dried and stored? And what is the recommended means of storage?
So seeds, depending on the crop, have different shelf lives, but squash, I think, is around 6 years. But that doesn't mean that after 6 years, they're all not good anymore. It's just that the germination rate will go down. And that's true for any seed. So sometimes even when we're packing seeds in the library and we notice that they're older, we give you more of them so that it'll hopefully account for the loss, of the ones that won't germinate. And really for seeds, your biggest enemy for storage is mold. So just making, and critters, I guess, if you like, if mice find your seed stores, they will definitely be happy. So anywhere that's protected from critters, and then a cool, dry, dark space. Some people store seeds in the fridge too, or freezer. And I don't. I just put mine in a closet, and usually in paper envelopes. However, you can use jars. You just have to make sure that the seeds are dry before you seal them up. Okay. Any other questions? Any general questions too, just about the seed library or anything else too we can answer now?
I have a question, just for everybody. When would we be doing the next seed mailing?
Oh, we'll be doing one in August. And at that time, we'll have both the warm and cool season seeds available. So if you are somebody who likes to start some of your cool season crops, in August, those will be available for you.
I have a planting question.
Uh-huh.
Cucumbers, is it too late in the season to start new cucumber plants from seed?
I don't know. I typically don't, but does anybody else in the, anybody who's here wants to chime in? I would probably plant from starts, I don't know if maybe from seed it might be too late.
Because my cucumbers are all looking pretty pathetic. I was getting grapefruits for a while, and then the leaves got all covered with weird stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I had to pull my first round of cucumbers. They got some sort of disease, and I do have little ones in the ground that are not producing yet, but I did put those in as starts, just I bought at the local nursery.
Okay, cool.
I think last year my cucumbers went till about September or October.
Yeah, so you might be able to squeeze in a planting from seed.
Maybe I'll try both.
Yeah, and then document it and let us know how it goes.
Well, everything I do gets documented on Instagram. So.
Okay, any other questions? And then I think we'll wrap it up.
I have a question. So I planted my seeds in my starter melon. When would be a good time to transfer them from my seedlings into the ground? For watermelon. It was the ones that, yeah, for watermelon. Yeah. So they're probably, I'd say about maybe a little under an inch right now. So they're just starting to come out of the ground, or out of my little seedling sprouting area.
Yeah. Typically after a plant has 2 true leaves, so when it first sprouts, it'll have those first little leaves that don't look anything like the leaves that the plant produces later on. So once it has 2 true leaves, it should be safe to transplant.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would say the sooner the better.
Okay, I'll do that this week then.
Mm-hmm. Okay, last call for questions. All right, well, I hope that this was useful for those of you who came, and I really do hope that everybody takes a stab at saving some squash seed and turning some into the library. That's just how we grow and make this library stronger, and our seed stores a part of our community. The more we contribute to them, the more they become ours and adapted to our microclimates. So yeah, and go ahead and save those tomato seeds too, because that's really easy. And beans if you've got them. But we'll be actually talking more about tomatoes and beans and saving those seeds in September. So you can tune in for that too. All right, and just keep your eye out for our announcement for August seed checkout and our upcoming presentations. And thank you for coming. We're so happy. All right.
One last thing. Is it okay for people to invite their friends to the next meeting?
Yes. So this one we purposely kind of didn't publicize really big because it was our first one and we weren't really sure, you know, how it was going to go. But yes, so next time we'll be at the library again and they'll be doing their own promoting. And yes, please share. Next time you can absolutely bring a friend.
Virtually at the library.
Yes, virtually. Yes. All right. Well, thank you. That concludes our meeting.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank
You're welcome.
you.